quickly scrambled and realized we can't put it off for a few days. We can't focus right now on the people overseas. We need to focus right now on the people who are being detained in U.S. airports, who are en route. And so we stayed up all night. Some of us took shifts. And by 6 in the morning, we had filed a lawsuit in federal court here in Brooklyn. And it was on behalf of 2 named plaintiffs and a class of people who would be detained, similarly situated, who would be detained in U.S. airports because of the first executive order. And the 2 named plaintiffs were Iraqis who had been helping our U.S. military for years. They had been vetted completely. They had special visas to come because they had helped the U.S. military, and even they were detained. So we filed the lawsuit at 6 in the morning. And then what we decided is that we need to reach out to the government to say, will you keep all these people in the country who are being detained at the airports until Monday, not remove them, so that the court can then hear this on Monday and decide how to handle it. And we quickly realized we didn't know anybody to actually call because the new administration had come in, all our old contacts were out the door by then, and we couldn't reach anybody. And so we started calling the U.S. Attorney's Office here. Fortunately for me, I had contacts. My sister is a public defender here, a federal defender, and she gave us emergency contact numbers for the U.S. Attorney's Office. So we started calling them, and they said, we'll get back to you, but we don't actually know what's going on. And so we realized that the administration had done this without even giving their own people a sense of what's going on, how to handle this. And it was clear that people on the ground for the government at the airports had no idea really how to handle this. So the U.S. Attorney's Office couldn't guarantee us anything. We couldn't reach anyone in Washington. So we started working on what are called stay papers, meaning the court has to issue an injunction keeping the status quo, not letting any of these people be sent back to their countries where they could have been harmed or killed. And so we worked on those legal papers and filed them at 5 o'clock that afternoon. So it's basically 24 hours since the ban has signed. And during that period, I was sort of working on all the legal work, but keeping an eye on the TV and slowly seeing everyone descend on the airports, which was, and I hope we can get back to this about sort of community support and what it means for a civil rights movement, but lawyers and activists and just everyday people were flooding the airports ready to help, protesting, doing legal work, doing anything they could. And it was slowly becoming an enormous deal at the airports around the country, and the TV stations and MSNBC and CNN were all carrying it live. I'm sure many of you saw those scenes at the airports. But I don't think at this point for me, I was fully grasping how big a deal it was becoming and how sort of big this organic movement was becoming. And part of it, I guess, is being tired from staying up all night and just also focusing on the legal papers. So we filed the legal papers at 5 o'clock asking for an injunction. We reached the judge, the emergency judge, who was there over the weekend, and she was actually in her chambers, and she said, fine, be down here by 7:30 on a Saturday night, tell whoever from the government you can reach that they ought to be here at 7:30. And we said, fine. And so I went and showered and put on a suit and prepared to go down to court. And I remember telling my wife and kids, I don't think it's going to be that big a deal. I should be back in about 45 minutes. And we went down to court, and we got there, and there were about 40 people outside the courthouse. And I said, wow, this is unbelievable. On a Saturday night, 40 people have showed up for support. And it ended up that more people obviously came, and I'll get to that in a second. But we got into court. The judge said, everyone can come in who can fit, and so it was about a third media, a third community people, and about a third the legal teams. And by the hearing started about 8:30, and it was one of those real dramatic moments that I'm used to, sort of more subtle court proceedings. And the judge started by saying to the government, look, I don't want a lot of melodrama, a lot of rhetoric. ask you some very pointed questions. And the government, just to step back a second, had people from the U.S. Attorney's Office there in the courtroom from Brooklyn, but no one from Washington, understandably, was able to get there. So they had a lawyer from the Department of Justice on the phone, and and in fairness to her, she was obviously at a disadvantage being on the phone. She was also at a disadvantage because, frankly, I don't think that she had been prepared for this and that the administration had given her any real heads up of what was going to happen. And the judge started very pointedly and said, look, I want to ask the government 2 questions and I want straightforward answers. The first question I want you to tell me is, why is the United States in danger if we keep these individuals here? I mean, these 2 named plaintiffs have worked for our military, our U.S. military. They have visas, they've been vetted. The same is true for everyone else who's gotten to the airport. They have visas, they've been vetted for years. Can you tell me now that the United States is going to be in danger if I keep them here while this case proceeds? And the government said, Your Honor, all I can say is the president thinks the country's going to be in danger. So the judge said, okay. And she then said, now I want you to tell me, can you assure me that if I send these individuals back to Iraq and other places in the Middle East and around the world, that none of them are going to be in serious danger? And the government, to their credit, said, candidly, we cannot give you that assurance. And the judge said, well, then I'm going to issue a nationwide injunction. And at that point, everyone in the audience started clapping. It was like one of those My Cousin Vinny movies, which I had never really been involved with. And, and it was really one of those dramatic, in the courtroom, it's hard to sort of recreate it, but it was very intense. And at one point, someone from the audience came up, a lawyer that we work with, but wasn't part of the case, actually came up and handed me a note. And I said, Your Honor, I've just been handed a note, and it says a woman and child are about to be put back on a plane to Syria in 20 minutes. And so unless you act very quickly, they may be in serious danger. And so it sort of had that feel, and the judge acted quickly. And then I asked the judge if the government would provide us with a list of all the people who are being detained. She said, I think that's a good idea. And we also asked her to order everyone on the ground in the airports to make sure no one's put back on a plane. And she did that. And so it ended, obviously, in a great way for us. And then we went outside, and when we walked out, there were 1,000 people there, 1,000+ people. And I'm sure and it was just an overwhelming moment, overwhelmingly emotional. And I remember calling my wife, quickly sneaking off and calling my wife and saying, I'm going to be a little later. It's actually a fairly big deal here. And she said, yeah, I know. We're watching live on MSNBC. And it was just the community support. And maybe I'll sort of end here, and then we can talk about community support, because I actually think we're in one of those real civil rights moments that, and I've been at the ACLU, as Lizzy said, since 1992, and I can't remember another moment like this. And, you sort of see documentaries about the 60s, what it was like. And this feels to me a little like that, and it feels so critical to have this community support, because what I always tell young lawyers is you can only accomplish so much with the legal arguments in court. The lawyers can only accomplish so much, and you need to build that atmosphere around the cases. And I think that's what's happening now. And maybe a little later we can talk about the contrast to after 9/11, because we were doing these same types of cases, but there was very little community support. And we felt very much like we had to bring those cases, but we didn't have huge outpourings of support. So it felt very different. And so I think, as most of you know, the president ultimately decided to withdraw that first Muslim ban and put in a revised Muslim ban. And so we've challenged that again. So far we've prevailed, and now the government has taken it to the Supreme Court. And our response to the government's papers in the Supreme Court are due at 3 p.m. Monday, and then at some point after that, we'll hear whether the Supreme Court's going to issue a stay, allowing the ban to go into effect over the summer, and whether they're going to take the case and hear it on the merits in the beginning of next term. And so, this is obviously a critical time. We do feel like we've won a lot by getting the order narrowed, but there's still a lot more. And I probably have talked too long, so I know you want me to sort of set the stage of everything else. The only thing I'll say, and then maybe we get to it later, is that the Muslim ban is a hugely important issue, partly because of the concrete impact it's going to have on people, and partly the symbolism. And I think, in general, that's why there was such emotion, at least for me, in my mind, why there was so much emotion that night in Brooklyn, is I think there was real despair in the immigrant community and just generally, how are we going to fight back? Can we fight back? Are our institutions going to work? And I think everyone was really sort of heartened to see that the courts are still there, the courts are not going to be cowed, and that we can fight back. And within 24 hours of him issuing this executive order, we had it blocked. And so the emotion was really palpable. But the one thing about the Muslim ban is it has sucked up a lot of oxygen, and there's an enormous amount going on in the rest of the country. As Lizzy pointed out, sort of real fear in immigrant communities, the Trump administration going after families, not going just after criminals as they're claiming. That's just a wrong narrative. And so maybe we can talk as we go on a little bit about what's going on the border, what's going on in Texas, because it's ultimately going to have an enormous impact. So let me stop there.
No, you set that next question up perfectly. Thank you. All I have to do is swing my bat now and send the ball to Joe. So we had this dramatic experience around the Muslim ban. What people often forget is that 2 days before the Muslim ban, Trump issued 2 executive orders targeting undocumented immigrants. One of the orders was, or immigrants, particularly from Mexico and Central and South America. One order was to begin building the wall, and the other was to significantly increase the numbers of people in the deportation force in this country. So, Joe, I was wondering if you could tell us what's been happening sort of for undocumented immigrants over the last 4.5 months. What experiences have they been having?
Okay. Thanks, Lizzy. And I also want to thank the Brooklyn Historical Society for putting this together and for inviting me to participate. There are a number of things I can talk about, but I'll just limit it to a few. So first, in terms of the executive order. So on January 25th, Trump issues 2 executive orders. One is focused on what's called interior enforcement, and the second one on the U.S.-Mexico boundary. In terms of interior enforcement, there are a number of aspects to the executive order, but the key one was to increase the number of ICE agents. ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It's a division of the Department of Homeland Security, and it focuses on the interior of the country. Right now, the size of ICE is about 5,600 agents. The executive order mandates an increase by 10,000, so basically a tripling of ICE. So that was the first thing. Second thing is this one focused on the perimeter of the United States. In addition to an executive order about the wall, which I'll talk about in a second, it mandated a growing of the U.S. Border Patrol, right, which has already grown massively over the last 2 decades. Right now, the number of U.S. Border Patrol agents, and the vast majority of them focused on the U.S.-Mexico boundary, not the Canadian boundary, stands at about between 21 and 22,000 agents. Right? It's the largest law enforcement agency, federal law enforcement agency, by the way, in the country. The executive order mandates an increase by 5,000 agents, right? So almost by 25%. Now, of course, all of this is predicated on authorization, and particularly appropriations from the Congress, and that's a question whether or not he's going to be able to get that. But this is what's on the table. In terms of the wall, right, that big, beautiful wall that he talked about so many times during the campaign, in addition to issuing this executive order, in March, the Trump administration put out a call for proposals, right, for construction agencies to actually give plans. And it requires that the wall be a minimum of 18 feet in height, but ideally about 30 feet in height. It's supposed to be formidable, that's the language it uses, impenetrable, and something to be able to withstand great levels of force. Right? The estimates of how much this would cost, and this doesn't come from the Trump administration, but from people who have studied this, is on the conservative end about $18 billion, on the more extravagant end somewhere around $40 billion. Now there are already about 700 miles of barricades, walls, fences, and low-lying vehicle barricades already in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. What makes this, the wall, very difficult, in addition to its high financial costs and the fact that most people in the United States, particularly in the border region, don't approve of this, is that most of the land on which the wall would now be built is privately held. Right? Most of the land in which the walls have already been built were federally held lands, right? And that means they're going to have a lot of lawsuits on their hands, right? Because landowners they don't like to give things away, right? And so, especially in Texas, right, where a lot of this new wall would go, it could be years of very costly litigation, right? But in some ways, the focus on the wall is a smokescreen, right? Because the wall, for all intents and purposes, in a lot of ways, is symbolic. And what's far more important is sort of the actual apparatus of exclusion that's put forth by human beings on the ground. And in that sense, what's Lee alluded to in terms of interior enforcement, which has been ramped up significantly, and something that gets very little attention, and that is what people call the thickening of the border, right? This started under the Reagan administration, but really took off under G.W. Bush and under Obama. And that is to sort of push the U.S. immigration apparatus outward to places like the Dominican Republic, to the interior of Mexico, to Guatemala, to Honduras, right? To enroll state authorities in those countries to sort of preemptively stop people from migrating towards the United States. The Department of Homeland Security has offices all over the world, right, in dozens of countries. Right? So this has become a multinational affair, the U.S. border policing apparatus. And John Kelly, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, played a key role in that as head of Southcom, right, and the Pentagon. And now as head of the Department of Homeland Security, he's ready to sort of put that on steroids. Right? Finally, let me just say something about sanctuary cities, right? New York City is one of these. The Obama administration certainly was not a fan of so-called sanctuary cities, which is it's not a legal term. It's something sort of has a loose definition. But under the Trump administration, what's taken place is a sort of a full frontal assault, right? We know about the threats to cut back federal funding for those cities that have declared, or municipalities or states that are declaring themselves sanctuary polities. Whether or not that's going to unfold is another question, but what we're beginning to see now is sort of a frontal attack against people who are present in those sanctuary cities. So the Border Patrol has legal authority to patrol up to 100 miles within the U.S. interior, okay? So, you can be 70 miles from the Canadian border in Vermont, and you can run into a U.S. Border Patrol checkpoint, right? The entire state of Florida, right, is U.S. Border Patrol territory. But recently, we're starting to see U.S. Border Patrol showing up in places where, historically, generally speaking, it has not shown up. So just last week or the week before, 137 miles from the U.S.-Mexico boundary in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles, the Border Patrol arrested a young immigrant rights activist. Now, whether or not this reflects administration policy or just individual agents or supervisors who feel emboldened by the Trump administration is not known, but this is a worrisome sign. And let me just say finally, in terms of this, it's important to keep in mind, and this was alluded to in Lizzy's opening comments, that this doesn't come from nowhere, right? What Trump is doing is building on very fertile soil. Now, as Lizzy mentioned, the number of deportations in the first 4 months is up by 40% over the last year of the Obama administration. But still, it's significantly below the height of the Obama administration's deportations, right? Deportations under Obama skyrocketed. What's different, right, is where these deportations are taking place. Under Obama, they took place much more in the border region, and they're less discriminatory, right? And that anyone is fair game, regardless of one's ties to the community, how long one's been here, what one's criminal record is or is not, right? And so it's much more a scattershot approach, and in this sense, he's sort of taking that fertile soil and putting it on steroids. Right?
So I'm going to read you a quote. And I'm wondering if anyone can identify the general era from which it comes, and the people about whom the quote is speaking. So here we go. It is impossible to overestimate the peril of the class of immigrants coming from this part of the world, and every possible care and safeguard should be used to keep out these undesirables. Is that today? 10 years ago? Any thoughts on when that comes? Yeah, what year roughly? Excellent. Gosh, that was too easy. That was great. Thank you. Yeah. So.
Could I just say something about that?
Yeah. They didn't hear it. So the answer is Eastern European Jews. The exact year was 1920. And it comes from a congressional report that was put out by Congressman Johnson from Washington State, who would go on to author the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which kind of fully closed the gates on many, many immigrants. And I'm going to turn to Libby in a second, but Joe, you wanted to jump in.
I just want to say, I mean, that's a great example, and there are many ones even further back in Benjamin Franklin wrote about the need to have very strong immigration controls about a particular group. He called them the most stupid people of their nation. He was talking about German immigrants in Philadelphia, right? So.
Wow, I had no idea, but thank you. That is a revealing anecdote. So Libby, in a lot of ways, none of this is necessarily all that new and foreign, even though we'd like to think it is. So can you rewind the clock for us and take us back to other moments in our history when xenophobia, nativism, bigotry were really sort of fueled crackdowns on immigrants and flourished in unhappy ways?
Yeah, sadly, I can. And the example you just gave is, I think, kind of where I'd like to end up. But in some ways, I think the question is, how did we get to that point? Where we are today. Like, where did that come from? And you, in your introduction, you kind of said that the nation has this notion of itself, and maybe New York in particular has a notion of the nation and of itself as a land of immigrants, and yet there's always been, right, since that moment of Ben Franklin's words that you just quoted, and since this sense coexisting, I think, with that idea that the nation is under siege by certain immigrants, and who that is and what that danger exactly is sort of changes over time. But just one example from the middle of the 19th century is the reception in some quarters of Irish immigrants. So Irish immigrants, by many, including here in New York City, where by 1850 something like 1 in 4 New Yorkers was an Irish person. So many people argue that these were people who adhered to a dangerous religion, because that religion meant having loyalties to a foreign power, the Pope, that these were people who were bearers of dangerous disease, or who were dangerously impoverished and were going to sort of pull down the economy, or who worked for low wages. The thing is that kind of, such sentiments, I think, didn't really have teeth in terms of sort of federal law until later in the 19th century and the 20th century, as the federal government was growing. And so I just want to sort of flag a few moments I think that's sort of became really, really important. One has to do with really the first group who was a target of really effective anti-immigrant organizing and of an immigration ban, and that was Chinese immigrants. And Chinese immigrants had been coming in greater numbers after the United States acquired all this new land in the West and in the Southwest, and came over the Pacific, and were incredibly important in building up the agricultural industry and the railroads, and sort of building up that part of the nation. And but they collided with the sentiments of white working folks who were also coming west, and really saw that as their territory and their jobs, and mounted a very effective anti-Chinese movement both in California and then later nationally, culminating in a couple pieces of legislation, first in 1875, and then a better known piece of legislation in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was specifically, explicitly about banning Chinese workers. And really the sort of first moment where the federal government is kind of flexing its power in terms of saying, these are immigrants that we decree to be a economic and a racial and a political and a social threat to the nation. And it was instituted as a temporary measure and then made sort of ever renewed and really in place until the 1940s. If we fast forward to the era that I write about, which is the early 20th century, sort of the World War I era and beyond, we see this kind of perfect storm of nativism, of anti-immigrant sentiment that really kind of takes hold of the nation and drives its policy and sort of shapes its policy for many years after that. So just to kind of name a few sort of forces that come together in that perfect storm, one was just the sheer number of immigrants coming in the late 19th, early 20th century. Something like 20 million immigrants come to the U.S. in that period, the 40-year period before 1924. And many of them were coming from places farther afield in Europe, especially farther afield than earlier immigrants, like farther east and south than the German folks or the Irish folks, so from Italy and the Russian Empire, and were regarded by many as being sort of dangerously foreign and different religions, different languages. So that was one thing. There was also this kind of rising belief in sort of a racial view of society. So these ideas about kind of breeding your way to a better society, these eugenicist notions in which you could classify all of humanity in this sort of racial hierarchy, and these new immigrants coming in along with Asian immigrants and other non-white folks were sort of seen at sort of various levels of the bottom of that hierarchy. There was also, during wartime itself, this real intense nationalism that took a very anti-immigrant turn that persisted after the war as well. The Russian Revolution and a whole wave of strikes, of workers going out on strike in 1919 also led to this fear of kind of dangerous political views coming in from abroad. There was a fear of a huge flood of refugees coming in after the war. So in that same congressional hearing, I think someone says, if there were a boat for all the Jews of Eastern Europe to get on, they would all get, 3 million Jews of Poland would get on that boat and come over here, and we don't want that. And those sentiments kind of taken together were reflected in changes in the law as well. So just to kind of name some of the highlights or lowlights, during wartime itself, before the U.S. entered the war, but as the war was raging in 1917, a major piece of legislation which instituted a literacy test for immigrants, which was supposed to sort of keep out the riffraff, and also barred a huge chunk of Asia, not only continuing the ban on Chinese immigration, but also putting a ban on migration from places like India and a huge chunk of Asia. In 1920, Congress was debating stopping all immigration. So there were several moments after that. There were strong proposals to just cut immigration off altogether. In 1921, another temporary law that then sort of makes its way into permanent law, the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which was supposed to put caps on immigration from countries that were considered to be the senders of inferior immigrants. And that law gets put into a more permanent place in 1924 in the law that you were referring to with this Quota Act of 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924, that again sort of makes permanent this ban on Asian immigration and gives these sort of tiny little quotas or numbers to the European nations that were also thought to be senders of inferior immigrants, dangerous immigrants, immigrants who were politically, racially, biologically, and culturally dangerous. And that law was enforced until 1965, although there were sort of major changes in that law. So that was really this deeply racial law that structured our immigration policy. And I'll just end by saying two quick things about that law. There's much to be said. One is that interestingly, or kind of horrifyingly, when that law was passed, there were also a whole bunch of people who were stranded by the enactment of it. So there were thousands of people who had some form of visa that the United States was no longer recognizing. And so one question that legal activists and community activists at the time were grappling with was like, how do we make a case for that, and how does that fit into this larger sort of nativist moment that we're in, one. And two, for a more contemporary moment, some of you may have read that the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, spoke admiringly of this law. This law has been sort of, by most folks, I think, in this country, kind of consigned to the embarrassing trash heap of laws, along with other kind of deeply racist laws that our country has had. But he praised its effort at kind of maintaining a balance. What it sort of said it was going to do was that it was going to kind of keep the population of the United States from changing too much. So it was on the face of it really neutral. Everybody at the time kind of understood that it was absolutely not neutral. And I found that a sort of horrifying shout out by the current administration to that moment of the past.
And if I remember correctly, he said
he
that
said it
in
in
an
2015.
interview with Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon did these documentaries. He sort of flirted with documentary filmmaking before he decided to destroy the world. And he did these interviews, and he also did a radio show, and he interviewed Jeff Sessions, and I think it was during that interview that Sessions expressed his admiration for the 1924 Act. So, in that act, we hear echoes of the present moment. And so I want to actually jump back for a second to the present, or to the recent present. And Lee, when you were talking, you alluded to a moment, sort of during the George W. Bush administration, when the seeds of what we're seeing now around sort of anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim legislation, those seeds were planted. A lot of people forget that moment because a lot of people weren't paying attention or they didn't care so much. So can you go back to 2001, 2002, and talk about the beginning days of anti-Muslim immigrant, anti-Arab immigrant legislation and actions in this country?
Yeah, sure. And, as a side note, the history is so interesting and so powerful. And the ACLU was actually formed then in response to the raids against Eastern European immigrants. That was one of the things that prompted the formation of the ACLU. And so we're sort of full circle. I think the 9/11 comparison is interesting. I think there's some similarities and some things that are different. One of the things that probably gets lost is that George W. Bush was not necessarily anti-immigrant generally, right? He came from Texas, and they just have to, nowadays is slightly different, but he was actually had somewhat of a pro-immigrant agenda, or at least parts of it, not all of it, but parts of it. So he came into office, and I don't think that we were expecting it to be a really sort of anti-immigrant agenda, and I think we were expecting potentially for him to push some pro-immigrant legislation. And then 9/11 happened. And so what happened was that everything got subsumed under the umbrella of national security. All immigrants started being viewed as national security threats, but obviously particularly Muslims and Arabs. And just as a side note, what sort of happened is that there were a lot of people who wanted to push anti-immigrant measures who had been trying for a long time but had never had the ability to do it. But then they started using the anti-immigrant sentiment from 9/11 to push through measures that really had nothing to do with 9/11. But on the Muslim Arab measures, right, that's where we saw really draconian things happening. And just as a side note, another side note is that the new FBI nominee was involved in a lot of those Muslim detentions, and there's an Internal Justice Department report that talks about the role he played, and it's not a favorable one. And so those moments were different for us, I think, because the country was understandably very nervous in the days, weeks, early months after 9/11. And I think that a lot of the support that we usually have from a lot of the quarters that we usually have wasn't necessarily there. There were people that were, again, understandably scared to get on the subway, scared, and no one knew what was going on, and it was a new thing for the United States. And there wasn't a lot of outcry about what was going on. And the administration was able to do that. Administration was able to do a lot of things, and we tried to challenge a lot, but we didn't get very far. Most of what we did in those first months, years, failed in court. And again, it goes to sort of the atmosphere around those cases. It was one of fear, and it permeates the whole process. And so I actually had a judge in one of my cases say, well, how many more people do you want to see die? I mean, why are you bringing this case? It's sort of, and that's obviously very different than now, where not everyone is supporting what we're doing, but there is an enormous push from the community. And so it felt very different for us. It felt like we were sort of all alone. And it didn't really change until the administration started losing credibility, because at first they were saying, look, we're doing everything by the book and don't worry about it, but then little things started slipping out, and then more things, and then the torture at Abu Ghraib and all those things, and it became clear that there were serious abuses. But it took a while before we could make any inroads, and that's obviously very different from now. But that sort of fear that Muslim immigrants are a danger, started back then. I think we had a lull for a little bit of time, but now Trump has taken advantage of it, and every time there is a new terrorist attack, and...
Lee, wait, sorry to interrupt. Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Of course.
Just because I think one thing I think that's sort of critical to point out is that, right after Trump took office, people stood up and said, if there's a registration, if Muslims have to register in this country, I'm going to register as Muslim. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that we had a registration of Muslims in this country. George W. Bush introduced a special registration system. Can you talk about that for 1 second and sort of those specific, like the NSEERS program and some of the really sketchy, scary stuff?
Well, we did see a registration program, and it was really troubling, and we tried to bring lawsuits, and the lawsuits failed. And I think people thought, let's do it, let's have this. But what's interesting is even that administration, after a few months, decided it wasn't actually doing anything for national security, and they abandoned it on their own. And so they learned the lesson that just because you call something a national security measure targeting Muslims doesn't mean it's actually effective. But what we're seeing now is the Trump administration saying, well, we're going to do it again, and say it's critical for national security, right? But it's a sort of history lesson that administration said no, and we're not going to do it for just PR. And you also see the community coming out, and the community didn't come out back then. And there was just, I think, just too much fear back then. And I think people have learned their lesson looking back, but you all can speak to it better. I mean, that's sort of what history gives us, is the ability. And we always try and push that narrative that learn the lessons of history. We always overreact. That's what we do. But in that moment of fear, it's hard. And the 9/11 fear was just more palpable because there actually had been that event. And I think now what we have is the president trying to gin up that fear, but people are pushing back, learn the lesson, and it's not necessarily come in response to a specific terrorist attack like that. So there's a lot of things that are the same and a lot of things that are different.
So I also just wanted to jump in with another kind of small piece of history. It was something I was actually reading today in a nice book by a historian named Deirdre Maloney, who writes about the history of exclusion and deportation in the late 19th, early 20th century. And she points out that there's the roots of kind of suspicion of non-Christian and religions runs really deep, and she specifically talks about this much longer history of anti-Muslim immigration policy. So, many Muslims were affected by this kind of broad ban on immigration from Asia, but B, we're also ended up getting caught up in U.S. policy against polygamy, and anyone coming in as polygamous, and we're often like, so these immigrants coming from Turkey, for example, were questioned very, very closely about their religious beliefs, and specifically sort of around what was considered this like dangerously foreign mode of having a family. So just to kind of like point, I mean, those are only two of many instances, but to point out that also these histories have histories, right? That I think clearly that's different in many ways, but that I think those roots matter.
And one of the things that may be different between now and 9/11 is I think our country, to some extent, not enough, but to some extent, has educated themselves a little bit about Islam and the Muslim communities. I think what we found after 9/11 was that no one really had an understanding of Muslims. They were really the other, like a lot of immigrant groups that come, but I think there was really a feeling like we don't know anything about them. They could be up to anything. They don't really, and so for us as lawyers, as advocates, one of the most critical things is we need to humanize whoever we're representing, because at the end of the day, if they're just seen as abstractions who might create terror, we have no chance of winning. And what was difficult after 9/11 is the country didn't know a lot about this community, but also because of the secrecy after 9/11, we couldn't actually get to the detainees. They were held incommunicado, and that's one of the things that the new FBI nominee was pushing, is holding them incommunicado, so we couldn't get to them, and we therefore couldn't tell their stories in a human way, right? There were Muslim men being detained for days, months on end, and we just had to talk about them as the detainees instead of saying, here's the picture of this person, and every day his child, 3 years old, says, when is daddy coming home? Why isn't daddy here? And we couldn't, and so I think now the country, is still not where they need to be, but there is this more human picture of the community that's been painted that's helpful. And so people are pushing back and say, yes, well, we're going to register as Muslims. I don't think people are as scared, but it's still there, and it's still the unknown. And that's what happens, I think you all, write about, is that's what happens all the time, is they're the other, and you don't actually think they hold those human values that you hold.
So I want to ask two more questions of Libby and then Joe, and then I'm going to turn it over to you guys. So that's just a quick sort of preview of what's going to happen. Lee, you talked about people being in detention centers. We referenced sort of this roundup of Muslims and something called the NSEERS program, where people had to sort of register with what is now ICE if they came from, I think, 13 or maybe 23 different Arab Muslim countries.
Yeah, it was 20 plus, 5
yeah.
plus, yeah.
So where did this whole apparatus come from, Libby? I mean, there was a period when my grandfather came here in 1920. He had to get a visa from over in Europe, but he actually wasn't required to get a visa per se to come here. He went to Ellis Island. Apparently it took maybe a few minutes. Some of his family got detained because they were sick, but ultimately, there wasn't this whole kind of apparatus in place. So there weren't necessarily legal and illegal immigrants. So can you tell us, how did this all come about? In a minute, no.
Yeah, in a minute.
In 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay, so I would just name kind of 3 things and try to say them briefly. And those 3 things to mention that kind of together are kind of key pillars of this apparatus. One is, as you're pointing out, documentation, right? So this idea of being documented or undocumented, which had to be invented. And the second is sort of the border, and maybe Joe, you'll talk a little bit more about that, but so kind of the policing of the border. And then the third is sort of the policing of the interior and the enforcement of immigration laws in the interior of the nation. So, documentedness was something that was kind of pioneered or piloted with the Chinese Exclusion Act. So other folks didn't need to show papers to come in, but Chinese immigrants were required to carry around papers, and this is in the act, you can see this in the law itself, to show papers to prove that they had the right to be in the country. Passports were not required of anyone until World War I, and it was a national security measure. There was a fear that spies would be sneaking over the border from Mexico, for example. There were some rumors about that. And it wasn't, so there was this kind of, you were supposed to get a visa, but it wasn't until 1924 that kind of the system of documentation was, this technology, I would call it, of documentation was really instituted in a much wider way. So you had to, in order to get permission to come under this quota from Europe, for example, you had to, or from anywhere, you had to get a visa, which was a whole complicated packet of stuff that you had to get. And so this really kind of, over time, creates the difference between documentedness and undocumentedness. So it might seem kind of low tech, but actually it's quite high tech, right? So there's this whole sort of filing system that the government institutes to try to track people. Individuals are being tracked in all these new ways over time. The border itself, in sort of the late 19th century, the only people who were being watched for were Chinese immigrants who were skirting the law by coming over the Mexican and Canadian border. But until the late 19th, early 20th century, the US wasn't even counting who was coming over that borders, right? So that only sort of comes into play later. It's not until after 1924, as many people are kind of getting around these new laws by coming over the borders, that the United States gets a border patrol going. So it's a very small, it's a tiny little, it's like, I don't know, a couple hundred people. It's a tiny little force, but that's the kind of seeds of that moment. And the last thing is that deportation, which is about sort of enforcing the laws in place, is again sort of pioneered in terms of Chinese exclusion, but then it really grows in the early 20th century, especially in the 1920s as well. I mean, none of that ever worked. Like, it never worked the way it was supposed to, and it was sort of, by today's standards, seems really small, but I think you can see the sort of beginnings of this apparatus, and also, perhaps more importantly than the apparatus, the idea itself that the architects of this stuff were creating, which was the idea that policing borders was imperative to sovereignty and to national security.
All right, I have another question for all of you, another quiz. So I'm going to read another quote, and I am wondering if anyone can identify the author or even the time frame. So here we go. The simple fact is that we must not and we will not surrender our borders to those who wish to exploit our history of compassion and justice. Any guesses? I mean, it's... All right, so... do you know who it is, Joe?
Yes.
Okay, you want to? Yeah. So this was my lead into your question about sort of how. But yeah, answer who it is.
So that's Bill Clinton, right?
Yeah, Bill Clinton in 1993. So Libby was just telling us about sort of the creation of this idea of documentedness, and obviously its opposite, undocumentedness, or what people refer to crassly as legality and illegality. And really the victims these days of this binary, of this construction, are mostly Mexicans and Central Americans. And so, Joe, I wonder if you could talk about sort of the moment when really kind of this country began focusing, obsessing about documentedness and sort of stopping undocumented immigrants from Mexico from coming here, notwithstanding the fact, of course, that many parts of this country were Mexico until 1848. So,
Right. As Libby suggested, the apparatus of control and exclusion was quite small for a very, very long time. And that both reflected and helped to produce a relatively low level of consciousness around border issues. At the same time, of course, as Libby pointed out, there's long been this sort of sense that the country is under siege from without, But what's striking about these senses or these moments is that they were momentary, right? They didn't have the enduring, deep energy that they do today. And the Clinton administration in the mid-1990s is really key in this regard. You know, when Bill Clinton and Al Gore, I think, were the ones that pioneered what's now sort of the common staple of U.S. presidential elections. The candidates write these books, and their book was called Putting People First. That's us, right? Putting People First. It's a pretty lousy book, but what's striking about it is how thin it is. They really have nothing to say on it. In fact, Clinton's first budget proposal in 1993 actually called for cutting the size of the U.S. Border Patrol by 93 agents. That's at a time when the Border Patrol had 4,200 agents. This is really unthinkable today, right? But that suggests how weak it was. But very quickly, the Clinton administration shifted gears. And just to step back a little before this, just to give you a sense of just sort of how weak things were in terms of the apparatus of exclusion, both materially and ideologically. In 1980, the U.S. Border Patrol's budget was $77 million. That was less than the budget of the city of Baltimore's police department, right? It wasn't until 1980 that the Republican National Platform, right, mentioned for the first time the issue of unauthorized or illegal immigration. And it wasn't until 4 years later that it spoke about the U.S.-Mexico boundary. In the case of the Democrats, it wasn't until 1996 that this was mentioned in their national platform for the first time. So this reflects, right, a real hardening. I have a Boston accent. Hardening, H-A-R-D, right? A real hardening ideologically and politically, geographically, about the way we sort of think about, in practice, boundaries. In some ways, something called Operation Gatekeeper was the embodiment of this. So Operation Gatekeeper was a geographically focused operation focused on the San Diego-Tijuana section of the boundary. At that time, it was estimated that about half of the unauthorized crossings in the United States were taking place there. And what the Clinton administration did for a whole host of reasons, largely because they were concerned about re-election, right? And California was the great prize, right? They were, you know, already in 1993, 94, they're thinking about re-election. They infused a huge amount of resources into that section of the boundary to try to undercut the Republican electoral strategy of beating the drums of war against unauthorized immigrants with a focus on the U.S.-Mexico boundary. And so this resulted, Operation Gatekeeper was sort of the centerpiece of a larger national strategy. And this resulted in about a 5-year period of a doubling of the size of the Border Patrol, from 4,200 agents to almost 10,000 by the end of the Clinton years, and a doubling of the Border Patrol's budget from $400 million to $800 million. Right? And so what it did is it sort of made this, what it had been, and I'm exaggerating here to make a more subtle point, sort of a more ephemeral, an ebb and flow sort of approach to immigration control and policing. It made that sense of siege and the response to the siege a permanent aspect of U.S. policy. And this was something that was intensified in the aftermath of 9/11, when the U.S. Border Patrol budget and its size doubled again. And this was something that the Obama administration helped to maintain and grow. And now with Trump, he sort of has this Frankenstein that he's inherited, and this is why he's able to do what he's trying to do right now. Right? Is that?
That's excellent and terrifying, so thank you. So we have a few minutes now, and I'd love to turn the conversation over to all of you, or engage you in our conversation here. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and Meredith has a microphone, and we'll all hear you, and then the speakers will respond.
Good evening. I don't have a question, I have a thought. We think about immigration currently as this Muslim issue, and it is. But I think we need to always remember and to continue to think about it more broadly. And what does it really mean? Because once we deal with this issue of Muslims, what else are we going to be dealing with? What else does Donald J. Trump have in mind? It is the whitening of America. Because once we move past this Muslim issue, what about the rest of the people in this room? what about African Americans? And you'll say, well, we were here. No. You know, we think we have to understand it from an historical perspective. We were brought here. I think about people like ICE who patrol. They're nothing but patrollers who patrol the American South to pick up Africans who were freed, who had manumission papers. Those papers could be taken away from them. They could be sold back into slavery. And if you think about it, earlier in history, putting African Americans back on boats, sending them back to Liberia. So all of this has meaning, and it comes under the guise of the whitening of America. So I think that this is so important that we continue to be active in looking at this and fighting it and seeing it for what it really is, more broadly.
Thank you. I think those are wise words. We're focusing very narrowly on immigration tonight, but of course, as you point out, Trump and Steve Bannon and the people working with him do have a much broader agenda and ideology, and a lot of people are at risk from this. So thank you. I think, you know, well, I was going to say more, but actually, do other people, I don't want to talk too much, do other people have questions?
I'm curious about the numbers of immigrants and what the levels and restrictions are now. Nobody's been talking about those at all recently, and I have no idea where we stand. We've always had numbers of so-and-so and so-and-so were allowed in. Where are we now? Does anybody know? Thank you.
Jody? Yeah, I mean, there are restrictions now. There's legal immigration, right? I mean, the people put the number at 11 million of undocumented immigrants, you know, which is, and then there's legal immigration, but there's backlogs in countries, and it's much harder to come in from some countries than others. And the other thing that people, and you all could speak to this probably better, is that there's a lot of people who look back and say, well, my family came legally, but it wasn't always this hard to come. And so, you know, there's all these things back and forth. I mean, I think we do need immigration reform, both legal immigration reform, and there's no question there's going to have to be some additional enforcement measures. There's nothing going to be passed without additional enforcement measures. But yeah, it's hard to come from a lot of countries, and so that's the pressure that gets put on it.
I was wondering about legal immigration, what the numbers were.
Yeah.
What the limits are.
Yeah, I mean, we've gotten rid of specific quotas. I can't remember last year the exact number of legal immigration. I can get that for you, yeah.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, for some people, it's basically, I mean, for most people in the world, it's impossible to migrate legally, right? And for those that are able to migrate, the wait is incredible. I was talking to an immigration lawyer the other day who does corporate immigration, and he's dealing with people who have visas to be here, and they're trying to regularize their status to become green card holders. People from India. The wait right now, he says, is between 15 and 16 years, right? So when they say get in line, you know, what are they talking about, right?
Good evening, thank you. I just have two quick questions. I wonder if the panel can address first how some of the response of the Clinton administration and after was a response to the Reagan amnesty program that was put into place in the late 1980s. And I also wonder if there's something to be discussed with respect to the fact that a number of undocumented people in the United States are being employed by large organizations or large companies in the country, with the government kind of looking the other way with respect to their status.
I'm just not sure what the question is.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, the two questions is, one, how can we address how some of our current policy is in place in context of the Reagan amnesty that was put into place, where a number of people who were undocumented in the United States were granted amnesty and allowed to stay, and then the borders remained porous, I believe. And second, my understanding is a number of people in the a number of undocumented people are allowed to work here for large organizations such as meatpacking plants, where they have fake social security numbers and are allowed to work. And this is kind of tolerated almost as a subclass in our country. Is that not a clear question?
So in terms of, all right, so the first part of the question, should I? Take it. Okay, so you're referring to IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 that was put in place by the Reagan administration. And through that, about 3 million people had their status regularized, right? Largely people of Mexican origin. Right? And in many ways, the fact that immigration reform has not been able to pass, in some ways, is a reaction against that. Right? So when you hear people saying, particularly in the Republican Party, no amnesty, they're referring to what happened under the Reagan administration. And so now what they're talking about is this arduous, very long path to citizenship, right? Which seems interminable in terms of the proposals that are on the table. Yes, there are lots of undocumented people that work in the U.S. economy, including probably not very far from here in downtown Brooklyn, right? And certainly in the meatpacking industry. This is one of the ways U.S. capital has restructured the meatpacking industry. This was a good unionized job, right? And now it is rife with non-union labor, and a significant amount of that is undocumented. People from Mexico, Guatemalans especially in the chicken industry, people from Somalia, et cetera, et cetera. Particularly, even more so is California agriculture, right? Which about 70% of California agriculture, the labor force is thought to be undocumented. So, I mean, this raises all sorts of issues, but I think most importantly, it raises the question of membership. Here we have people, membership is what citizenship is all about. These are people that contribute to the well-being of U.S. society, and especially relatively affluent people like myself. What are our obligations to them? Right? It seems to me that we need a lot more than amnesty. Right? They're effectively members of the society already. There are people that we go to school with. There are neighbors. There are people we work with. And the fact that they're so-called illegals is a reflection of the basic injustices that are at the heart of this immigration control system. And I was just going back to that, the first question, or the first sort of comment. This is an issue not only in the United States, this is true throughout the world, especially in relatively affluent countries. From South Africa to France to Germany to Australia, you see the same types of abuses. There are unique expressions in the United States, but more than anything, this is a war against the global poor. Right? I teach at Vassar College. At Vassar College, we don't have migrants, we don't have illegals, we have expats. Right? We have international students, right? We have people from other countries who come work there, right? When we talk about so-called illegals, we're talking about the poor. And this is a war on the poor on a global level.
I would also just add to that the fact that that undocumented or unauthorized immigrants do serve capital also has a really long history, right? So that as soon as restrictions on migration started affecting people coming over the border from Mexico into the United States, who had been coming for a long time, in part because U.S. employers had been actively recruiting them, including doing illegal recruiting by going to Mexico and doing that recruiting, like to bring people to work at railroads and stuff like that. As soon as there were rules in place that made it really difficult for people to cross the border legally, and some came outside the bounds of U.S. law, employers saw that as a real plus for them, right? It was sort of much easier to employ vulnerable people who didn't have as much power to protest their situations. So that history has been building for a long time. And a word about sort of amnesty. In some ways, even though that 1986 law kind of seems in retrospect to be a real anomaly, since the implementation of sort of harsher immigration laws. There have been a number of such moments in which people could claim something that we might understand as amnesty. So in 1929, in 1940, in 1948, 1958, there were laws that sort of made it possible for large numbers of people to regularize their status. Who actually got to do that that good was not distributed equally. It was often sort of benefiting people who already had citizen relatives, who were white, who had legal representation. But nevertheless, it's more historically, it's sort of more the norm than the exception, that there have been moments in which the legal system has sort of bent to recognize that there are people living in the United States whose status was unauthorized but should become so.
I have a question, actually, which is about timing. How much time do we have?
I think we have time for one more question.
One more question. And then I would love to end with one final question to these guys. Is that permissible? Okay. But, sorry, I shouldn't be the person.
You mentioned sanctuary cities, and I'm just wondering, are mayors having some impact in so-called sanctuary cities? Are they being able to protect people at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk to that. I think it remains to be seen. I think definitely in places like New York, I think they are, and I think they will continue to. And I think the federal government lost their initial battle to force Santa Clara and San Francisco, and so that's hardening. I think what you ought to look at, though, the real battle going forward may be states trying to clamp down on progressive cities. So we just filed a lawsuit in Texas that I think is going to end up being closely watched and is going to be a big deal. Texas, not the federal government, passed a law saying no town, city, or county in Texas can be a sanctuary city. And so that's sort of the next generation of big legal issues. To what extent do the states, can they clamp down on their own cities as opposed to the federal government doing it? And I think if we win there, it may hopefully stem a tide around the country. If we lose the Texas lawsuit, I think we're going to see lots of laws like this. And it's raising important legal issues about the relationship between the states and the cities, not just in the immigration area, but there's a lot of progressive laws being passed at the city and town level on race relations, LGBT rights, different types of laws like that. And you see conservative governors try to clamp down. And so I think the implications of this will go well beyond immigration. In New York, I think we have a governor and a mayor who don't want to see that type of stuff. But in other states where you have a red state but with blue cities, it's going to be very tricky. And I think that's the issue to watch for going forward.
So I want to ask one final question. And all of you, I'd love it if you could each answer it quickly, give your thoughts on it. So it's resistance. Lee, you mentioned Texas, SB4, the state law that was just passed there. We saw a massive outpouring in Austin where people flooded the Capitol, progressive people, to protest this law, SB4, outlawing sanctuary cities. We have seen, obviously, people flooding to airports when the Muslim bans were passed. Just earlier this week, a bunch of people got arrested in San Francisco. They went into an ICE office to protest the arrest of 2 undocumented workers. So all over the country, we're seeing this burbling up of protest. I guess my question for each of you independently quickly is, what do we do now? We are in this horrifying moment, but also a moment that is ripe with the possibility of people resisting in really creative and impassioned ways. Where are we going to see that protest? What should people be doing? How can people here get involved, specifically or generally? So if you have thoughts, I'd love to go bing, 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 or bing, 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 or however you guys want to do it.
You mean beyond donating to the ACLU?
I do. Yeah, I do.
Right. I think, in my mind, I think there's no one way to resist. I think the critical thing is that people not lose steam, and we keep it up, because I think it's really been helping and working. And I think the great fear is that people start to get complacent and see it as the new normal and just stop. And if we can keep it up, I think we'll be in good shape. And I don't see one particular way that's necessarily more effective than others.
Okay. Showing up, though, keeping up.
Right.
Keeping up the pressure. It's a good suggestion. Joe, I'd love to hear from you.
I think there are a number of organizations in New York that people could support and be active with. Make the Road New York is one of them. The New Sanctuary Movement in New York is doing really important work. There's a whole host of organizations that people could be active with. And I think that this activism that Lizzy highlights is very, very important. And at the same time, I think it's imperative that we be cognizant of the limitations of it, because what it's doing, and this is necessary, it's focusing on the excesses, right? The things that seem extra normal. But the thing that's in some ways most pernicious is what's become normal, this apparatus of control and exclusion. And in that regard, I think it's important that we look to other historical moments to try to find inspiration. And what I find inspiration in is looking at the abolitionist movement, the movement against slavery, and the movement against Jim Crow. Those movements at their very best, were about recognizing the common humanity, particularly of those people at the receiving end of the oppressive apparatus. Right? And until we see, I think Libby said something about, or no, maybe it was Lee, about humanizing those people who have been otherized, right? We have to figure out what that looks like, not only in a sort of a cerebral sense, but what that looks like in terms of institutionally, our laws. And in that regard, the law itself is the problem, right? In many ways, what Trump is doing, there's really nothing wrong with it, if you accept the very basis, his set of assumptions. The United States has a right and obligation to determine who belongs here. Right? That's what he's doing. He's putting that into practice. And that's the foundation for all the violence that we see. And until we challenge that, just like people did in fighting anti-miscegenation laws, which were in place in the United States until 1967, Loving versus the state of Virginia, right? Until we're willing to challenge it in that fundamental way, I worry that we're going to be having these types of conversations for a long time, and not only in the United States.
I give to the ACLU. And I want to second what you both have said, but just to add one other thing that might be a little bit of a plug for what I do, but I want to just say something that a student of mine said today. So today was my last day of class, and I teach this immigration history class at Kingsborough Community College, which has a lot of students who are really worried right now, a lot of immigrant students, a lot of students with immigrant parents. And this is a student of mine who is Albanian, Muslim, and worried. And I asked them if at the end of this semester of studying history they felt more hopeful or more pessimistic. And he said, so they were sort of debating that and felt both ways, and also have different political views. I also have a really avid Trump supporter in that class, who is also an immigrant. And he said, I think that the thing is really about sort of education, really about understanding, really about sort of being able to question the basis for these laws. And it's about, it's like people don't understand the stuff that is being said on the news or the debates that's being had unless they think sort of really deeply into the issue and can really think about what a border is and where it comes from, and sort of who the people have been who've come to the United States over the years. So I guess I'll leave it with my student Tico's ideas.
I like that. I think that's the best possible answer, to leave it with your students who have come from other places to this country. So I think we're going to wrap up now, but thank you all so much for being here and being part of the conversation. And it's been a thrill to be here with all of you. So have an excellent night. Thanks a ton.